It all started with a single piece of paper, an ultimatum that shook the very foundation of an entire continent. The letter was delivered through private channels, clear and to the point. Donald J. Trump, the former president and global magnate, demanded control over Burkina Faso's resources, specifically 90% of the country's oil and gold. The tone wasn't one of diplomacy or negotiation. It was pure, cold, hard power. Deliver, or face the consequences. This wasn't a formal demand from the United States government. It was a message from Trump himself, wielding his business empire like a sword, using his global influence to secure more resources, more control, and more wealth. Burkina Faso, a country that had been off the map for so long, had suddenly become the target of an economic blitzkrieg. A country that had only just discovered significant oil reserves and had been sitting on one of the world's richest gold veins, was about to become the next prize in a global game of economic warfare. The demand was simple, straightforward. 90% of your oil and gold, or there will be consequences. A single sentence that carried the weight of centuries of exploitation. The letter wasn't just a request, it was a direct order, laced with the threat of force. And at the bottom of that letter, stamped in thick red ink, was the name that would haunt the president of Burkina Faso for the coming days, Donald J. Trump. What no one expected was President Ibrahim's response. Ibrahim didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even stall. The president of Burkina Faso, a man who had seen the worst of colonialism, military coups, and the depths of exploitation, wasn't about to back down. In the quiet of his presidential compound, Ibrahim called in his military commander and intelligence chief. There, in the confines of his war room, he made a decision that would change the course of African history. With the weight of an entire continent watching, Ibrahim turned to his closest allies and delivered one simple message. Tell the Americans, this land is not for sale. That one sentence didn't just echo in the walls of the presidential palace. It reverberated across Africa, from Lagos to Johannesburg, from Kinshasa to Nairobi. The ripple effect was immediate and powerful. For once, Africa wasn't afraid. It wasn't cowering in fear. This time, the world saw a different Africa, one that had risen from the ashes of its past and was willing to fight back. Ibrahim's message wasn't just a political stance. It was a defiance of imperialism. It was the first real challenge to the old powers that had spent decades pillaging the continent. No one had expected the response. They didn't expect a small, landlocked country like Burkina Faso to defy the United States. And yet, that's exactly what happened. This wasn't just a rejection of Trump. It was a statement to the world. Africa was no longer going to be a resource extraction site. This wasn't just about oil and gold. It was about Africa's sovereignty, its independence, and its freedom. Ibrahim's words, simple and forceful, signaled the beginning of a new chapter for the continent. But what was going to happen next? How would the world respond? As the ultimatum was delivered, Ibrahim began to prepare for the worst. He knew that the threat wasn't just about economic leverage. It could escalate into something far more dangerous. The question wasn't if the West would retaliate. The question was how. The tension was palpable. The whole world watched as Burkina Faso stood its ground. But what came next would leave everyone stunned. As the hours passed, the world watched in anticipation. The global stage was set, and what was at stake was much more than just the oil and gold beneath the soil of Burkina Faso. It was about sovereignty, about whether a small African nation could stand up against one of the most powerful empires in the world. It wasn't just about Ibrahim's leadership anymore. It was about the resilience of a continent that had been exploited for centuries. It was time for Africa to stand firm. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim's office was already humming with activity. The initial shock of the letter had passed, but the weight of the situation was now settling in. Ibrahim had made his stand, but now the hard work began. The president summoned his closest allies to a secure, underground war room, a place where even the walls seemed to whisper of past conflicts and struggles. His military commander and intelligence chief were the first to arrive. There, they would lay out the groundwork for what would become a new kind of resistance. The message had been delivered to the Americans. Burkina Faso was not for sale. But the real work lay in the coming days, in how Ibrahim and his government would turn words into action. Ibrahim had made it clear to his top military officials, there would be no retreat. There would be no compromise. The first order of business was defending the nation's assets, specifically its resources. The oil and gold deposits of Burkina Faso weren't just the economic lifeblood of the country. They were the key to its future. The discovery of significant oil reserves had been a closely guarded secret for months, even years. Only a small group of trusted individuals knew the true value of what lay beneath the ground. Now that the world knew, and now that Trump's demands had been made public, the nation's resources were a target. President Ibrahim's military and intelligence teams began their meticulous work. The oil-rich Eastern Corridor was immediately locked down. The borders were reinforced with military checkpoints, and all civilian traffic was suspended. No foreign observers were allowed near any of the key installations. The country's energy infrastructure was put under high-level surveillance. Any attempt to disrupt or tamper with the country's resources would be met with swift retaliation. Drones were positioned in the sky, patrolling the oil fields. The airspace above Burkina Faso was closed to all foreign aircraft. But that wasn't all. The nation's gold wealth was just as valuable. In 2023, Burkina Faso produced over 57 tons of gold, nearly 80% of its exports. The precious metal wasn't just an export commodity. It was essential to the nation's economy, forming the backbone of state revenue. Ibrahim understood that the country's gold was just as much a target as its oil. So, in tandem with securing the oil fields, he issued a national order. No ounce of gold would leave the country without state protection. The SOMI, Burkina Faso state-owned gold agency, was immediately put under military control. The agency's leadership was called to a closed-door meeting, where Ibrahim laid out his directives. No foreign contractors could operate without government oversight, and all gold export routes were to be rerouted through military corridors. The country's precious resources would no longer be subject to foreign influence or manipulation. They would belong to the people of Burkina Faso, and the government would be the sole protector of these resources. The world outside Burkina Faso continued to watch as these developments unfolded. The international press was kept in the dark about the full scope of the nation's preparations, but rumors began to leak. Burkina Faso wasn't just defending its resources, it was preparing for war. Meanwhile, Ibrahim's government wasn't just focused on the military aspect of this resistance. He knew that true resistance was built from the inside, from the hearts and minds of the people. So, while the military was fortifying the borders and securing the gold and oil deposits, the civilian population was being mobilized. And this wasn't a government-led initiative. It was a grassroots movement that was already taking shape across the country. In Ouagadougou, the streets began to fill with people. Women, many of whom were old enough to remember the scars of colonial rule, gathered in front of military barracks to offer food, water, and medicine to the soldiers. These were not state-mandated efforts. They were the people of Burkina Faso acting on their own, uniting in defense of their country. Elsewhere, university students, once a group known for their protests against the government, had turned their attention away from political debates. They weren't just protesting, they were organizing. They began drawing up detailed logistical plans for the coming months. They weren't just discussing the next big demonstration. They were organizing night patrols and supply chains for the soldiers on the front lines. They translated Ibrahim's speeches into multiple regional languages, ensuring that every corner of the country was informed and united in the cause. In the rural villages, miners, who had spent their lives working the land and extracting gold, came together to form local patrols. They volunteered to keep watch over key government buildings and facilities, as well as vital supply routes. Taxi drivers redirected their passengers to support troops, and fishermen delivered dried goods to military outposts. It wasn't just a resistance, it was a revolution, a movement of unity that stretched from the heart of Ouagadougou to the farthest corners of the country. No one told the people to move. They acted on their own. It was as though the heart of Africa itself had stirred, and it was beating in sync with Ibrahim's defiance. The international media, meanwhile, continued to focus on the global narrative. They questioned whether this was a diplomatic error or a provocation that could lead to war. But they failed to understand the true power of what was happening in Burkina Faso. This wasn't just about a man standing up to an empire. It was about a nation taking back control. And outside Burkina Faso's borders, the story of this resistance was being heard. From the universities of Accra to the streets of Nairobi, Africa began to rise. The support wasn't just coming from Burkina Faso's immediate neighbors. It was spreading across the continent, through countries like Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. In the United Kingdom, black activists and organizers held silent protests outside the U.S. Embassy. They weren't just standing in solidarity with Ibrahim. They were standing in solidarity with Africa. But as the world began to rally around Burkina Faso, Ibrahim's eyes were not on the headlines. He wasn't worried about the press. He was focused on protecting his nation. Every move he made, every decision he took, was part of a larger vision for the future of Burkina Faso, one where the nation's sovereignty could no longer be taken for granted. His response wasn't just a defense of resources. It was a defense of the freedom of his people, of Africa's right to choose its own future. In the heart of northern Burkina Faso, under a sun-scorched landscape that many had long since dismissed as barren, an astonishing discovery was waiting. For years, there had been whispers in the shadows, small murmurs from local surveyors and cautious reports buried deep within the archives of colonial-era maps. But it wasn't until recently that President Ibrahim, a man who had learned the harsh lessons of Africa's colonial past, began to suspect the truth. Burkina Faso was sitting on vast and untapped oil reserves, resources that could rewrite the country's future. He had always known that there was something beneath the earth in northern Burkina Faso, something valuable, though it had never been confirmed. The government had always assumed it was just a matter of time before such reserves would be discovered, but the scale of what they uncovered when they began drilling exceeded everyone's expectations. Months earlier, Ibrahim had ordered the formation of a covert task force, made up of engineers, military officers, and a handful of trusted foreign experts, to investigate the potential of the land. This team operated in total secrecy. Russian seismic experts mapped out the fault lines under the earth. Iranian drones scanned the terrain under the cover of night, and North Korean coders developed encryption systems so sophisticated that they could rival the best Western security protocols. The operation was blacked out, with no official government approval given. Only those in the highest circles knew what was happening. When the drill broke the surface of the earth, the result was not a small reservoir of oil or a few traces of fossil fuel. No, what emerged was a pressurized flow, strong enough to change the course of a nation's destiny. The discovery wasn't just significant, it was a game changer, one that could place Burkina Faso on the map as a global energy player. The national pride that surged through Ibrahim's veins was matched only by the fear he knew was coming. For a moment, he stood there in the war room, looking at the raw footage from the satellite drones, his mind racing with the implications. The future of the country, of his people, was now forever linked to this discovery. No one could take it back, and no one could ignore it. The first problem was that the rest of the world had yet to learn what Burkina Faso had just uncovered. The second problem was that the West was already watching. The satellite feed had already been picked up by foreign powers, the United States, France, and other global players with stakes in the African energy sector. This wasn't just any oil discovery. It was a sovereign resource, untouched by foreign corporations, untapped by multinational contracts. This discovery wasn't made to enrich the world's powerful. It was a goldmine that Burkina Faso intended to control itself. News of the discovery wasn't leaked through official channels. It wasn't supposed to reach the public eye, at least not yet. But satellites in space don't lie. Within hours, the thermal readings from the oil flare were picked up by military and corporate systems across the globe. The panic spread fast. Chevron called an emergency board meeting, and U.S. intelligence immediately flagged the anomaly as a potential national security risk. The French government's energy branch raised an alarm about a strategic realignment in the Sahel region. Oil companies, like vultures circling a carcass, immediately began making plans to secure rights to the land. But there was one huge issue. Burkina Faso wasn't inviting anyone in. As word began to spread in Paris, Washington, and London, the reactions were mixed. Some saw an opportunity to intervene. Others saw it as a challenge to their established grip on Africa's resources. What no one could fathom, what no one expected, was that Burkina Faso wasn't going to allow its oil to be taken. There would be no multinational companies, no IMF-backed loans, and certainly no Western-controlled extraction. President Ibrahim knew what had to be done. He had already prepared for this moment. He had never trusted the West. He had seen the legacy of exploitation too many times in Africa. From the poisoned wells of colonial rule to the modern-day resource curse that kept entire nations enslaved by foreign debt and corporate greed, Ibrahim understood one thing above all. Burkina Faso had to stay independent. He immediately issued a new set of orders to his top military commanders. His government would fully control the oil fields, and no foreign influence would be tolerated. All foreign companies operating in Burkina Faso were given a strict deadline to either comply with government regulations or leave the country. Any foreign oil contractor who did not accept the terms would have their operations terminated. The international community, meanwhile, began to respond with outrage. France issued a formal complaint, calling the actions of Burkina Faso a violation of international trade norms. The United States convened an emergency session at the United Nations to discuss possible diplomatic and economic repercussions. But the world was missing the point. Burkina Faso was no longer asking for permission. What followed was nothing short of an economic war. France, the United States, and other powers launched a media campaign aimed at discrediting Ibrahim's government, claiming that his policies were destabilizing the region and threatening global oil supply chains. Mainstream media outlets, from CNN to BBC, started running headlines about the dangerous rise of African authoritarianism, warning that Burkina Faso was emerging as a rogue state. They painted Ibrahim as a madman who was endangering the fragile peace of West Africa. But what the world's elites didn't realize was that their narrative wasn't sticking. In Burkina Faso, the people had already made their choice. The news of the oil discovery wasn't a curse. It was a blessing that could change the future of the country, of the people. And in every corner of Africa, from Ghana to Tanzania, the news of Ibrahim's defiance spread. Activists, journalists, and citizens across the continent began to rally behind him. They weren't just rallying for oil, they were rallying for a new kind of African sovereignty. Ibrahim's next move was simple but bold. He would now seek allies not in the West, but in Africa. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, leaders who had watched Burkina Faso's courage grow decided to take action. The AES, Alliance of Sahel States, was born in the shadows, forged not just through diplomatic talks, but through shared resistance and an unspoken understanding. President Ibrahim knew that he couldn't face the West alone. But the AES wasn't just a diplomatic alliance. It was a military coalition, a defense network designed to safeguard Africa's future from the very forces that had looted it for centuries. As Burkina Faso solidified its position, the AES began to deploy tactical military reinforcements to the Sahel region, securing the oil reserves and ensuring that no foreign force would ever think of taking them. The response was swift, coordinated, and unwavering. But still, as the political and military pressure increased from the West, the question remained, would Burkina Faso stand alone, or would Africa finally begin to rise together? When the world turned its gaze toward Burkina Faso, with the discovery of massive oil reserves and the subsequent defiance of Donald Trump's ultimatum, President Ibrahim knew that his fight wasn't just against the West. It was against a legacy of exploitation that had plagued Africa for centuries. But one thing was clear. Burkina Faso couldn't do this alone. Ibrahim's refusal to back down was only the beginning of a much larger story. In a secluded room deep within the presidential compound, far from the prying eyes of foreign diplomats, Ibrahim met with his most trusted allies, the leaders of Mali, Niger, and Guinea. These were countries that, for years, had watched as foreign powers carved up Africa's resources with no regard for the people who lived on the land. They were tired of the lies. They were tired of the exploitation. And they were ready to make a stand. The AES, Alliance of Sahel States, wasn't just born out of political necessity. It was born out of shared suffering. Every country in the Sahel had faced the ravages of colonialism, neocolonialism, and the constant plundering of resources by foreign powers. But Ibrahim, more than anyone, understood that Africa had to fight back, and it had to do so together. Mali, under the leadership of Colonel Imi Goïta, was the first to make a move. Imi Goïta, a hardened military officer who had seen the worst of Western intervention in Africa, offered his support without hesitation. He wasn't just going to let another African country be picked apart. He knew the cost of submission. He had witnessed it firsthand in his own country. Niger followed quickly, with General Abdurrahman Chiani, an experienced military strategist who had fought in the harsh desert wars of the Sahel. Chiani had watched from the sidelines as his country's resources were siphoned off by foreign corporations, and now, like Goïta, he was ready to take action. Guinea, led by Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, completed the trio of powerful military leaders who would form the backbone of the AES. Doumbouya had come to power through his own country's revolution and was no stranger to the power of direct action. He had seen what happened when countries like Guinea were left vulnerable to foreign exploitation. Now he was committed to ensuring that Burkina Faso's fight was one he could stand behind. These men weren't just heads of state or military leaders. They were brothers in arms, united by the understanding that their nations and their continent were under attack. They weren't going to let Burkina Faso stand alone. They couldn't. The alliance was formed in secrecy. No press releases. No public announcements. It was simple. Africa had to rise or it would fall. The AES's first military action was swift and coordinated. As the world's attention was fixated on the drama unfolding in Burkina Faso, the border regions of the Sahel were secured. Mali, Niger, and Guinea sent their best units to reinforce Burkina Faso's defenses. The country's military forces worked together in perfect synchronization, patrolling the borders and ensuring that foreign forces would not be able to infiltrate or exploit the oil fields of Burkina Faso. The drone surveillance across the Sahel was ramped up immediately. AES drones, fully equipped with advanced surveillance technology, began flying overhead, monitoring every square inch of the region. The skies above Burkina Faso were secured, and no foreign aircraft could enter without AES forces tracking their movements. The borders, once porous and vulnerable, were now guarded by a combined military force that had one mission: to protect Burkina Faso and its sovereignty. It wasn't just about military defense. The AES also began to shift the global narrative. Their first task was to ensure that Burkina Faso's story was told on their terms. The media campaign launched by Western powers to discredit Ibrahim was met with counter-narratives from AES-affiliated media outlets. These weren't corporate news outlets trying to protect the interests of foreign powers. These were independent voices on the ground, telling the world that Africa was no longer willing to be exploited. In Bamako, the capital of Mali, students flooded the streets, marching in solidarity with Burkina Faso. The youth, once politically disillusioned, were now marching to the beat of a new drum, one that echoed the cries for African freedom and sovereignty. They wore T-shirts with Ibrahim's face, emblazoned with the words, "We are Africa. We rise together." In Niger, women came out to deliver food to military camps, chanting slogans in support of Burkina Faso. Mothers and daughters, grandmothers and aunts, all stood side by side, reinforcing the message that Africa was united. The world superpowers might have their military bases and their economic might, but Africa had its people, and it was time for them to reclaim their power. In Guinea, artists painted murals of Ibrahim on city walls, depicting him as a symbol of African resistance. The artist community turned its efforts toward capturing the spirit of the AES. With every stroke of paint a declaration of intent. Africa would no longer be a pawn in a global chess game. Guinea's public sentiment was clear. If Burkina Faso stood, we all stand. It wasn't just the leaders of the AES who were taking action. The people were in motion. The protests, marches, and shows of solidarity were so widespread that the West could no longer deny what was happening in Africa. The continent wasn't just watching. It was rising. Meanwhile, back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim and his advisors knew that the time for words had passed. The world was already changing. He wasn't worried about whether the West would respond with sanctions or military action. He was preparing for it. Burkina Faso's sovereignty was no longer negotiable, and he had made that clear to the world. But the true power of the AES wasn't just in its military might. It was in the collective spirit of Africa. The AES had become a symbol of shared resistance. The Sahel had become a shield, protecting Burkina Faso not just from foreign intervention, but from a future of exploitation and submission. As the world held its breath, waiting for Burkina Faso's inevitable confrontation with the Western powers, President Ibrahim knew the stakes had never been higher. The economic and political repercussions of his actions were profound. But what was unfolding in Burkina Faso wasn't just about oil or gold. It wasn't even about one nation standing alone against the empire. No, this was about something much bigger. It was about the awakening of an entire continent, Africa rising and demanding to take its place in the world, not as a victim, but as an equal. From the beginning, the international media had spun the story of Burkina Faso's defiance in a predictable way. They called it a dangerous act of defiance, destabilizing the region, and they warned of the same old narrative that had been used to justify colonialism and imperialism in Africa for centuries. The rise of authoritarianism in Africa. The headlines screamed, trying to paint Ibrahim as a tyrant who had lost control. They used the same old tactics, the same old words. But for once, those words didn't stick. Because the truth was, President Ibrahim wasn't just resisting Donald Trump or the United States. He was standing against a century of exploitation, against a global system that had stolen the wealth of Africa without ever giving anything back. And what Ibrahim had done, in a single bold move, was show Africa that it could stand on its own 2 feet. No longer was it a continent shackled by the past. Now Africa had its own future to shape, and it was ready to take control of its own resources, its own destiny. In Ouagadougou, as the military bolstered defenses and patrols, Ibrahim knew that the next step had to be a shift in Africa's global narrative. No longer could the world view Africa as a collection of weak, fractured nations, waiting to be dominated by foreign powers. The rise of Burkina Faso's defiance was the beginning of something larger, and Ibrahim had to make sure that the message was clear. Africa was no longer a playground for exploitation. The AES had acted with precision, with coordination, and with one common goal: to protect the sovereignty of Burkina Faso, to defend the very idea that Africa had the right to control its own resources. But now, the fight was moving beyond Burkina Faso's borders. It was becoming a movement, and it was spreading like wildfire across the continent. From the students marching in Bamako, to the women chanting in Niamey, to the artists in Guinea painting murals of Ibrahim as a hero, the message was spreading. Africa is not for sale. But the West wasn't ready to accept this new reality. They hadn't anticipated that Africa would push back so hard, so fast. The United States, in particular, couldn't stand the idea that a small African nation was showing the world that it didn't need the West to succeed. This wasn't just about economic interests anymore. This was about global power. If countries like Burkina Faso could stand on their own, if they could control their own resources without Western influence, then the entire system of global neocolonialism would begin to unravel. The backlash came swiftly. The U.S. government issued a series of threatening statements, warning that the actions of Burkina Faso would have severe consequences. The State Department condemned Ibrahim's actions, and pressure mounted to bring Burkina Faso to its knees. Behind closed doors, the U.S. military began discussing possible interventions, whether economic sanctions or even military options, to ensure that Burkina Faso would never get away with defying Western power. But the response from Burkina Faso's allies was just as swift. The AES stepped up its operations. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, military forces went into high alert, coordinating with Burkina Faso's defense to prepare for any foreign aggression. But it wasn't just military power they were wielding, it was story. The African media, now united under the banner of the AES, began to launch a counteroffensive. Radio stations across the Sahel began broadcasting Ibrahim's speeches, reminding the world of the long history of African exploitation. The message wasn't just about resisting one country. It was about rejecting an entire system. The headlines across Africa became unified. Africa is not your gold mine. Africa is not your gas pump. The collective African voice, once fragmented and voiceless in global politics, had found its power. In London, Paris, and Washington, protesters, many from African diaspora communities, marched in solidarity with Ibrahim and Burkina Faso. In the UK, organizers held vigils outside the Foreign Office, demanding that their governments respect Africa's right to choose its own future. In Trinidad, radio hosts played Ibrahim's speech over reggae and calypso rhythms, blending his words with the soul of Africa's fight for independence. Even in the United States, African Americans began to rally, echoing the call. Africa's resources are not for the taking. It wasn't just the global protests that marked the changing tides. It was the decision made behind closed doors by the world's biggest players. China and Russia, once again, moved swiftly. The Chinese government sent a delegation to Ouagadougou without fanfare, with no red carpet, and no press conferences. The Chinese delegation didn't come with threats or ultimatums. They came with solutions. They offered Burkina Faso a deal that would rewrite Africa's future. The offer was simple: a fully modular oil refinery that would be built without Western banks or multinational corporations involved. It would operate using Chinese technology and expertise, but it would be owned entirely by Burkina Faso. There was no IMF debt, no strings attached, just a partnership based on mutual respect. In the same week, Russia sent military experts, not to occupy, but to train Burkina Faso's military in new forms of defense, in electronic warfare and asymmetrical defense techniques. These weren't mercenaries or soldiers looking for profit. They were defense specialists, committed to ensuring that Burkina Faso's sovereignty was protected, and that the country could stand on its own in the face of global pressures. The deal was struck swiftly and quietly. By the end of the week, a new partnership was formed, one that didn't rely on Western loans, didn't rely on foreign corporate exploitation, but instead relied on sovereignty. Burkina Faso's future was no longer tied to the whims of global financial institutions. It had found an alternative, a way to move forward without bending to the West. The world was stunned, while the West plotted and schemed, trying to figure out how to deal with this unexpected challenge to the global order. Burkina Faso had already flipped the script. It wasn't about oil. It wasn't about gold. It was about sovereignty and the right of every nation, especially African nations, to control their own fate. The final move came on the floor of the National Assembly of Burkina Faso. Without warning, the government of Burkina Faso passed a resolution that nationalized all oil and gold reserves within the country. This wasn't just a political move. It was a declaration of war against the global systems that had long profited from Africa's resources. The message was simple: Burkina Faso's resources were now and forevermore the property of its people. The West could no longer exploit Africa's wealth without consequence. As Ibrahim stood before his people, holding the decree of nationalization in his hand, his voice rang out clear and resolute. "We have been exploited for generations," he said. "But now, Africa is standing tall. We will not bend. We will not yield." And the world heard his words,